The bright chandeliers of the grand hall glowed like artificial stars, casting an elegant golden hue over the perfectly polished marble floors. The air smelled of expensive perfume and aged whiskey, mingling with the distant sound of live violin music. Laughter and murmured conversations filled the space, each voice belonging to someone important: wealthy men in tailored suits, women draped in diamonds, and attendants moving like shadows, ensuring the evening ran smoothly. This was not a place for the desperate. And yet, at the farthest corner of the hall, Meera Khalid sat frozen, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it over the noise. Her stomach twisted with nausea, but she refused to let her fear show. She was already out of place in this world of money and power, and she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her like an unbearable force. How did it come to this? She thought bitterly. How had she been reduced to this moment, to being nothing more than a transaction? A woman waiting to be sold? Meera had once dreamed of a better life. Not one of riches and power, but one filled with love, warmth, and security. She had once believed in happy endings. But life had not been kind to her. Ever since she had been left alone to raise her son, Adam, every day had been a battle against hunger, unpaid bills, and the relentless fear of losing everything. There were nights when she had to pretend she wasn't hungry, just so Adam could eat the last piece of bread. There were days when she held him as he cried himself to sleep. Too young to understand why their tiny apartment had no heat, why his mother worked until her hands bled, and why he couldn't have the same childhood as the other kids he saw at school. She had tried everything, every possible job, every humiliating plea for help. And still, the debt piled up. The notice of eviction had arrived the previous week, along with another hospital bill for Adam's asthma medication. That was the moment Meera realized she had no more choices. So when she had overheard whispers about an auction unlike any other, she had thought it was a joke at first. A secret gathering where the wealthiest men in the world bid on women, not as mere objects of desire, but for companionship, business arrangements, even children. The idea disgusted her. It went against everything she believed in. But desperation had a way of stripping away one's pride. And so here she was, sitting among other women who had made the same impossible decision. Some looked indifferent, as if this was just another job. Others were visibly nervous, their hands shaking as they adjusted their dresses. But none of them looked as terrified as Meera felt. A man in a crisp black suit approached, his expression unreadable. He leaned down slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're next." Meera inhaled sharply. Her body was trembling, but she forced herself to stand, to smooth the fabric of the long, flowing dress they had given her. She felt exposed, like she had been stripped of her dignity and left with nothing but her fate in the hands of strangers. The voice of the auctioneer rang out over the speakers, his words theatrical and polished. "Lot number 23, a vision of grace and beauty. A rare gem, an exotic treasure unlike any other. Gentlemen, who will begin the bidding?" Meera stepped onto the stage, her entire body rigid. Bright lights flooded her vision, making it difficult to see the faces staring at her. She heard whispers, murmurs of approval. She hated this. She hated every second of it. But she thought of Adam, of his laughter, his small hands clutching hers, his sleepy voice whispering, "I love you, Mama," as she tucked him into bed. She couldn't fail him. The first bid came almost immediately. $100. Someone called out from the left side of the room. $250. Another voice countered. The numbers climbed, each one stabbing at Meera's heart. She was being bought, her future decided by men who saw her as nothing more than a luxury. $500. $750. Then, suddenly, a voice cut through the noise, deep, commanding, absolute. $1 million. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the source of the voice. At the back of the hall, seated with an air of unshakable confidence, was Zayn al-Rashid. Meera's breath hitched. Even she had heard of him. A man known for his power, his ruthlessness in business, and his unmatched wealth. A billionaire who rarely appeared at public events, let alone something like this. His presence alone was enough to make the entire room hold its breath. The auctioneer, though momentarily stunned, recovered quickly. $1 million. Do I hear any higher bids? Silence. No one dared challenge him. Sold. Meera felt her knees buckle. But she remained standing as the auctioneer sealed the deal with a satisfied smile. She had been bought. As she stepped off the stage, she felt a presence beside her. Zayn. He was taller than she expected. His tailored suit fitting him perfectly. His face sharp and unreadable. His dark eyes locked onto hers. Not with lust, not with amusement, but with something even more unsettling. Power. Without a word, he extended his hand. She hesitated. Come, he said simply. Meera's fingers trembled as she placed them in his. The warmth of his palms startled her. But she quickly looked away. A man who could drop $1 million without blinking was not a man to refuse. As she followed him down a long hallway into a private room, she realized her life was no longer her own. Whatever came next, she could only hope she would survive it. The silence in the private room was suffocating. The walls were lined with dark mahogany. The scent of leather and expensive cologne lingering in the air. The tension between Meera and Zayn was palpable. An unspoken battle of wills. He sat in an oversized chair. His posture relaxed but his gaze intense. Like a predator assessing its prey. Meera stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he might hear it. The reality of her situation was setting in. She had been bought. And now, she was at the mercy of a man she didn't know. Zayn finally broke the silence. Sit. It wasn't a request. Meera hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But where would she go? The doors to this world had already closed behind her. And escape was no longer an option. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress as if holding onto the last pieces of herself. I assume you understand what this arrangement entails. Zayn's voice was smooth, controlled. You are now under my protection. In return, I expect loyalty, discretion, and obedience. The word obedience made Meera's skin crawl. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. And what exactly am I to you? A purchase? A contract to be fulfilled? Zayn tilted his head slightly, studying her. A necessity. The answer was unexpected. Meera furrowed her brows, waiting for him to explain. I need an heir, he continued, his tone matter of fact. A child to inherit my name and continue my legacy. That is why you're here. You will bear my child. And once that is done, you will leave. The words you will leave echoed in her mind like a cruel joke. The weight of the contract settled over her like a crushing force. She had agreed to this, to give up her body, to create life, and then to walk away from it. She felt sick. Meera's voice shook as she spoke. And what if I refuse? Zayn's expression didn't change, but his dark eyes sharpened. Then your debts remain. The apartment you live in? Gone. The bills you cannot pay? Overdue. The food you cannot afford for your son? Still missing. Her stomach twisted at the mention of Adam. Zayn leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk between them. I know about him. Your son. Meera's breath hitched. How? I make it a habit to know everything about the people I do business with. His voice was calm, but the statement itself was chilling. Meera clenched her fists. This is why he bid on her. Not because she was beautiful. Not because she was special. But because he had seen her desperation and knew she had no choice. Zayn continued, his voice quiet but firm. You will have everything you need. Security, luxury, a comfortable life. Your son will be taken care of. You will be able to provide for him in ways you never imagined. In exchange, you will fulfill your role. It's a fair deal. Fair. The word was a slap in the face. But was it? Hadn't she come here knowing this was the outcome? Hadn't she willingly stepped onto that stage, letting herself be bid on like an object? Tears burned the back of her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. What if I want to keep the child? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zayn's jaw tightened. That is not an option. The finality in his voice was terrifying. He had already made up his mind. This wasn't a family he was creating. It was a transaction. Meera exhaled shakily, staring down at the table. And what happens if I don't conceive? Zayn leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Then we try again, and again, until you do. The words sent a cold shiver down her spine. There was no way out. Her hands trembled as she reached for the pen Zayn had placed in front of her. The contract was thick, filled with clauses and legal jargon she could barely understand. But the key points were clear. She would carry his child. She would leave once the baby was born. She would receive a fortune. Enough to secure Adam's future forever. Her son's face flashed in her mind. The nights he had gone to bed hungry. The times he had clung to her, asking why they didn't have a home like the other children. The moments she had promised him that one day things would get better. Meera's fingers tightened around the pen. This was the price she had to pay. With a deep breath, she signed her name. The moment the ink dried, something inside her shattered. Zayn took the contract, scanning it briefly before nodding in approval. Good. Tomorrow, you move into my estate. Meera barely heard him. Her mind was numb, her body weightless, as if she had just sold a part of her soul. She had done this for Adam. But what if she had made a deal with the devil? The next morning, a black limousine arrived at the small apartment Meera shared with Adam. Saying goodbye to him was the hardest thing she had ever done. He had clung to her, his small hands gripping her dress. Why do you have to go, Mama? He asked, his wide brown eyes filled with confusion. Meera swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile. I have to work, sweetheart, but I promise, I'll call every day, and when I come back, everything will be different. Adam wiped his nose on his sleeve. Different how? Meera cupped his face, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Better. The words felt like a lie. She watched as her elderly neighbor pulled Adam into a hug, whispering comforting words. Then, before she could change her mind, she stepped into the limousine. The car door shut, and with it, the last piece of her old life. The Al Rashid estate was unlike anything Meera had ever seen. Tall iron gates opened to reveal a world of opulence, lush gardens, fountains taller than buildings, a mansion so grand it looked like something from a dream. The driver escorted her inside, where she was greeted by a team of staff. A woman named Amal, the head housekeeper, guided her through the sprawling halls, explaining the house rules, her daily schedule, and the medical exams she would undergo. It was clear, this was not her home. It was a place of purpose. That night, Meera stood by the massive window in her new bedroom, staring out at the endless desert beyond the estate walls. She felt like a prisoner in a golden cage. A knock at the door made her jump. Zayn stepped inside, his presence overwhelming the room. Are you comfortable? He asked. Meera turned, arms crossed. Does it matter? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No. They stared at each other, an unspoken challenge passing between them. Zayn exhaled slowly, stepping closer. You made a choice, but you still have a say in how this unfolds. You can fight me every step of the way, or you can accept it. Meera's jaw clenched. I don't know how to accept something like this. Zayn's gaze softened, just a fraction. You will. And with that, he left. As the door clicked shut behind him, Meera sank onto the bed, pressing her hands against her stomach. Nothing had even happened yet, but she already felt like she was losing herself. She thought of Adam. She thought of the child she would one day carry. And for the first time since signing that contract, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The first few days at the Al Rashid estate were suffocating. The mansion was vast, its golden chandeliers, marble floors, and intricately carved walls screaming luxury. But it felt like a cage, one where she was expected to exist, but not truly live. Meera had been given everything she could possibly need: designer clothes, lavish meals, a private suite bigger than her entire apartment back home. And yet, she had never felt so empty. Zayn remained distant, their interactions brief and cold. He was a man of precision, every word calculated, every action deliberate. Meera had expected him to gloat, to remind her that he owned her now. But he didn't. Instead, he ignored her. That was worse. It was a reminder that she was just a contract, a body with a purpose, and that once that purpose was fulfilled, she would disappear from his world. Meera spent her nights staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the fountain outside her window, wondering if Adam was okay. She had spoken to him every day, but hearing his voice was both a comfort and a knife to the chest. I miss you, Mama, he had whispered on the last call. Meera had turned away from the camera so he wouldn't see her cry. I miss you too, my love. That night, she had curled up in bed and sobbed silently, clinging to Adam's old shirt, the only piece of him she had been allowed to bring. On the sixth day, Meera was summoned to Zayn's office. Her stomach twisted as she stood outside the grand wooden doors, staring at the gold handles. Amal, the head housekeeper, gave her an encouraging nod before stepping away. Taking a deep breath, Meera pushed the doors open. Zayn sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his dark eyes scanning a document before he lifted his gaze to her. "You're late." Meera bristled. He hadn't given her a specific time. "Sorry," she muttered, stepping inside. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." The room smelled of leather and cedarwood, the soft crackling of the fireplace the only sound as she settled into the chair. "You're scheduled for your first medical checkup tomorrow," Zayn stated, pushing a document toward her. "Dr. Saeed will ensure you're in the best condition to conceive." Meera flinched at the word conceive, like it was some kind of project. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she took the paper. "And if I'm not ready?" Zayn's expression remained unreadable. "Then we wait." Meera's breath hitched. She had expected coldness, but not patience. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could marry anyone, have an heir the proper way. Why me?" For the first time, Zayn hesitated. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Marriage is complicated," he said simply. "Emotions make things messy. I don't want messy. I want certainty." Meera stared at him, her mind racing. So that was it. He had bought her womb because it was simpler than love. A part of her wanted to hate him. But another part saw something else. A man who didn't know how to love. Over the next few weeks, Meera settled into a rhythm. She woke up, had breakfast in her suite, and spent most of her day in the gardens or library. She avoided Zayn as much as possible, only seeing him when required. He was always busy, always working, always alone. Meera found herself watching him from a distance, wondering what it was like to be him, to have everything, yet nothing. One afternoon, while wandering the garden, she overheard two maids whispering, "Did you hear about Mr. Zayn's fiancée?" Meera froze. "Which one?" The other maid giggled. "The one who left him at the altar." Meera's breath caught. "He doesn't talk about it." The first maid continued, her voice hushed. "But Amal says that's why he doesn't trust anyone anymore. He gave his heart away once, and it nearly destroyed him." Meera stepped back, her heart racing. She had assumed Zayn was just another cold, heartless billionaire who saw people as objects. But now, she wasn't so sure. One evening, Meera was returning from the library when she heard a crash from Zayn's office. Alarmed, she hesitated before pushing the door open slightly. Zayn stood behind his desk, his hands braced against the wood, his breathing ragged. A broken glass lay at his feet, its shattered pieces glistening in the dim light. He didn't notice her. He looked lost. Meera stepped inside before she could stop herself. "Zayn?" His head snapped up, his eyes dark and stormy. For a moment, she thought he would snap at her. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "Go back to your room." Meera. She should have. But something about the way his voice broke at the end made her stay. She walked forward cautiously. "Are you okay?" Zayn let out a bitter laugh. "You're the last person who should care." "Maybe." Meera hesitated before reaching for the spare glass on the desk. Pouring water from the decanter, she placed it in front of him. "Drink." He stared at her before reluctantly taking the glass. He took a sip, then another. "Why are you being nice to me?" he muttered. Meera sighed, crossing her arms. "Because I know what it's like to break and have no one there to pick up the pieces." Zayn looked at her then, really looked at her. For the first time, she saw something other than power and control in his eyes. Pain, regret, and, maybe, the smallest flicker of hope. That night changed something between them. Zayn didn't become softer overnight, but he stopped ignoring her. He started acknowledging her presence, asking about her days, even sharing small details about his own. Meera found herself listening, genuinely curious about the man behind the mask. She learned that he hated coffee but drank it anyway. That he worked himself to exhaustion because he didn't know how to stop. That he collected rare books but never had time to read them. She also learned that he had lost his mother at a young age. And that his father had never loved him. Love is a weakness, Zayn had told her one night. It makes people reckless. Meera had shaken her head. No, it makes people brave. He had fallen silent after that, staring at the fire with a look she couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or longing. Meera knew she was walking a dangerous line. She was falling, not just into this world, but into Zayn himself. And that was a problem. Because this wasn't real. She was just a contract. A temporary presence. And when the time came, she would have to walk away. Even if her heart didn't want to. Meera never thought she'd feel safe in this place. Not in a mansion where she was bought and bound by a contract that dictated her every move. Not in a world where power, money, and control ruled over everything, including people's lives. But somehow, against all odds, the walls around her had begun to crack. And it terrified her. Because the one person she had vowed to keep her distance from, the man who had purchased her womb like a business transaction, was the very person who had become her sanctuary. Zayn. And the worst part? He didn't even know it. Meera had spent weeks convincing herself that this wasn't real. That Zayn's quiet gestures, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he brought her tea when she had trouble sleeping, the way he stood up for her when his business partners dismissed her as just the surrogate, were meaningless. That his lingering gazes, his rare but genuine smiles, his unspoken concern for her well-being, were nothing but obligations. But then, one night, everything changed. Meera had been reading in the library when she heard a thud from Zayn's office. Curious, and slightly concerned, she peeked inside, expecting to see him working late. As always. Instead, she found him slumped over his desk, his head resting on his arms, his breathing shallow and labored. "Zayn?" He didn't respond. Panic surged through her as she rushed to his side, shaking his shoulder. "Zayn, wake up!" A pained groan escaped his lips as he stirred. His skin was burning. His hands trembled as he tried to push himself up but failed. Meera didn't hesitate. She grabbed his phone, dialing the estate's private doctor. "Send someone now," she demanded. "Something's wrong with him." Minutes felt like hours as she stayed by his side, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead, whispering his name, willing him to stay awake. And in that moment, watching him so vulnerable, so unlike the powerful, untouchable man she had come to know, she realized something. She couldn't lose him. Not just because she depended on him. Not just because he was the father of the child she would eventually carry. But because, somewhere along the way, he had become more. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. By the time the doctor arrived, Zayn had slipped into unconsciousness. His body had been pushed past its limits, exhaustion, stress, and dehydration all taking their toll. The man who carried an empire on his back had finally collapsed under its weight. Meera sat beside his bed that night, watching him sleep, her hands curled into fists. "You idiot," she muttered. "You act like nothing can touch you. But you're just as human as the rest of us." A soft knock at the door made her turn. It was Amal, the head housekeeper, the only person who had shown her kindness from the start. "Miss Meera," she whispered, stepping inside. "You should rest. You've been here for hours." Meera shook her head. "I'm not leaving." Amal hesitated before giving her a knowing smile. "He needs someone like you. You know." Myra's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The older woman sighed, glancing at Zayn's sleeping form. "For years, this house has been empty. People come and go, but no one stays. He's built walls so high, no one can climb them." She met Myra's gaze. "But you found a way inside." Myra's chest tightened. She wanted to deny it. To say she was just another temporary presence in his life. Just another contractual obligation. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't just falling for him. She was falling for the man he was when no one was watching. The next morning, Zayn woke to find Meera asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on her arms. His throat felt dry, his body heavy, but the first thing he noticed wasn't the pain. It was her. He watched the slow rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her hair framed her face, the way her lips parted slightly as she exhaled. She had stayed. For him. Something in his chest twisted. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he could control it. By the time Meera woke up, Zayn was sitting up, sipping water, looking far too composed for someone who had nearly collapsed the night before. "You should go," he said, his voice cool, detached. Meera frowned. "Excuse me? You don't need to be here," he said, setting his glass down. "I'm fine." Myra's eyes narrowed. "Zayn, you passed out at your desk. You had a fever of 104. You are not fine." Zayn's jaw clenched. Meera could see the shift in his expression, the moment he started retreating again. She had seen it before. She hated it. "Why do you do this?" she demanded, crossing her arms. He didn't answer. Why do you push people away the second they get too close? Her voice trembled with frustration. Is it because you think they'll leave you? Zayn's eyes darkened. That's enough. Meera. No, she snapped, stepping closer. It's not enough. You can keep pretending you don't care. You can keep telling yourself that emotions are a weakness. But I see you, Zayn. His breath hitched. I see the way you check on me when you think I'm not looking. I see the way you pretend to be indifferent when you're actually the most careful person I've ever met. And I see the way you looked at me last night, when you thought you wouldn't wake up. Zayn's fingers curled into fists. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Silence. Tension so thick. It was suffocating. Then, finally, he broke. Zayn exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. Because I can't afford to lose you. Meera's heart stopped. She barely had time to process the words before he continued. Everyone I've ever let in has either left me or betrayed me. So, I don't let anyone in. It's easier that way. Meera swallowed, her chest aching. And what about me? Zayn looked at her, really looked at her. You're the only one I don't know how to push away. Meera didn't know how it happened. 1 second, she was standing across from him, her heart pounding. The next, his lips were on hers. It wasn't a soft, hesitant kiss. It wasn't careful. It was desperate, raw, and filled with every unspoken word they had never dared to say. When they finally pulled away, Zayn rested his forehead against hers. This wasn't supposed to happen, he whispered. Meera's hands tightened around his shirt. I know, but neither of them moved. Because for the first time in their lives, they had found something worth risking everything for. If you've made it this far, tell me, should Meera trust Zayn? Was this love, or was it just another game? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you believe in fighting for love, no matter the cost, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will keep your heart racing. Meera had always known secrets had a way of unraveling. She just never thought hers would be exposed this way. Not like this. Not with Zayn standing in front of her. His expression dark and unreadable. Holding the very thing she had sworn he'd never find, a worn, faded photograph. A photograph of a little boy. A boy with her eyes. A boy with his features. Zayn's grip on the picture was tight. His knuckles white as he slowly lifted his gaze to hers. Explain this, he said, his voice quiet, controlled. Too controlled. Meera's heart slammed against her ribs. She had prepared for many things in her life, running, hiding, surviving. But not this. Not the moment he found out about their son. Meera had spent years making sure the truth never surfaced. Because she had no choice. She had been desperate when she entered that auction. Convinced she had no other way to keep her son safe. No money, no home, no future. A mother who couldn't feed her child was no mother at all. So she had done the unthinkable. She had sold herself. And in doing so, she had sealed a contract with a man she never expected to feel anything for. A man who was now staring at her as if she had shattered his entire world. Zayn exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. How long? He asked. Meera opened her mouth, but no words came. She didn't know how to answer because there was no answer that could fix this. Zayn took a step forward, his jaw tight. How long have you been lying to me? Meera swallowed hard. I never lied. Then what do you call this? His voice was sharp, but beneath it was something worse. Something broken. Meera felt her chest tighten. I call it protecting him. Zayn's breath caught, his grip on the photograph tightening. You think I would have hurt him? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Meera looked away. I couldn't take that risk. A silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Zayn took another step forward. You stole my son from me, he said, his voice cracking. Meera flinched. You took away years I can never get back. Tears burned her eyes. I had no choice. You always had a choice. Zayn snapped. You just didn't trust me enough to be part of it. His words cut through her like a blade. Because he was right. Meera had spent so much time convincing herself that keeping Zayn away was the right thing to do. That men like him, powerful, ruthless, and bound by legacy, could never love a child born out of obligation. That their son would only ever be an heir, not a boy who deserved to be loved for who he was. But now, looking at Zayn, his pain, his heartbreak, his raw betrayal written across his face, she realized she had underestimated him. Terribly. Zayn turned away. running a hand through his hair. He looked lost, a man who had just discovered he had been living a lie. "You should have told me," he murmured. Meera blinked back her tears. "Would you have let me go if I had?" Zayn froze. He turned back, his gaze sharp, piercing, but this time, uncertain. Meera exhaled shakily. "If I had told you I was pregnant when I signed that contract, would you have let me leave?" Zayn didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. He wouldn't have. Zayn sat heavily on the edge of his desk, his elbows resting on his knees. He stared at the photograph again, his thumb brushing over the small, innocent face of the boy he never knew existed. "What's his name?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Meera hesitated before answering. "Aries," she whispered. Zayn inhaled sharply, closing his eyes as if the name itself wounded him. "Aries," he repeated softly, letting it settle in his heart. His son. The son he had never held. The son he had never even known to miss. A tear slipped down Meera's cheek. "He looks just like you." Zayn's throat bobbed, but he didn't speak. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. Meera slowly stepped closer, her hands trembling. "I never wanted to keep him from you," she whispered, "but I was scared." Zayn clenched his fists. "Scared of me?" Meera shook her head. "Scared of what you might do. Scared of what you would demand of him." Zayn looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And now?" Meera's voice broke. "Now, I just want him to have a father." Zayn's breath shuddered, and in that moment, she saw it. The war inside him, the rage, the regret, the deep, aching loss of all the time that had been stolen from him. But beneath all of it, there was love. And that terrified Meera more than anything. Zayn stood slowly, his gaze locked onto hers. "I want to meet him." Meera's heart pounded. "Zayn, I'm not asking." "Meera." His voice was calm, but firm, unwavering. "I'm his father." Meera wiped at her eyes. "I know." Zayn stepped closer, and for the first time in years, he didn't look like the powerful billionaire who owned the world. He just looked like a man who had lost something precious and was desperate to find it again. "I will be in his life," he said quietly, "and I will never let him feel like he wasn't wanted. Not for a single second." Meera felt her throat tighten. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Zayn exhaled sharply. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Zayn had imagined many things in his life. He had envisioned business empires rising and falling under his command. He had prepared for hostile takeovers, ruthless negotiations, and betrayals from men he called allies. But he had never imagined this moment, standing just a few feet away from the child he had unknowingly brought into the world. His son, Aries. The little boy sat on the floor, his small hands carefully stacking colorful building blocks into a tower. He hummed softly to himself, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. And so was Zayn's. Meera stood next to him, her breath unsteady. She had brought him here, to the tiny apartment she had fought so hard to keep. The only home Aries had ever known. She had opened the door to the truth. And now, it was up to Zayn to step inside. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. For years, he had lived in ignorance. For years, he had believed he had no child, no legacy beyond his wealth and his empire. But all that time, this little boy had been here, growing, learning, laughing, without him. A part of him wanted to be furious. To demand why Meera had hidden Aries. To demand how she could have made such an impossible choice alone. But then he saw him. Really saw him. The way his tiny fingers carefully balanced one block on top of the other. His tongue peeking out in concentration. The way his dark curls fell into his eyes, the exact shade of Zayn's own hair. The way his expression flickered with quiet determination. The kind Zayn had seen in the mirror for years. And suddenly, all that anger vanished. Because how could he be angry when the proof of everything he had ever wanted was sitting right in front of him? A son. His son. Meera placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to." "I do." Zayn cut her off, his voice rough. This was his moment, his chance to do what should have been done years ago. Zayn took a deep breath. Then slowly, carefully, took a step forward. Aries looked up, his bright brown eyes locking onto Zayn's. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Meera held her breath. Zayn held his entire world in that one fragile moment. Then, Aries tilted his head, blinking curiously. "Hi," the little boy said. And just like that, Zayn forgot how to breathe. He had faced kings and sheikhs, men who had built nations with their hands, and had never once faltered. But one tiny word from a little boy had shattered him completely. "Hi," Zayn whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. Aries studied him with the same sharp curiosity that had defined Zayn his entire life. "Who are you?" Aries asked, his small hands gripping a red block tightly. Meera's hand trembled at her side. This was the moment she had feared the most. Zayn's throat tightened. He could lie. He could hide behind formality. Take this slow. Ease his way into Aries' life. But something deep inside him, something raw, something real, wouldn't let him do it. He knelt down, bringing himself to Aries' level. "My name is Zayn," he said softly, "and I'm your father." Silence. Meera exhaled shakily. But Aries didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. Zayn braced himself for rejection. For the fear, the confusion, the anger that would rightfully come next. But instead, Aries frowned, his small brows furrowed together as if he were solving a puzzle. "You look like me," Aries finally said. Zayn's chest collapsed in on itself. The words were so innocent, so pure, yet they held a lifetime of longing. Zayn nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I do." Aries studied him for another long moment. Then, in the simplest way only a child could, he shrugged. "Okay." And just like that, Zayn's heart, a heart he had convinced himself was made of stone, broke into pieces. Aries reached for another block, glancing up at Zayn again. "You wanna play?" Meera pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Zayn let out a shaky breath. The weight of this moment too much and not enough all at once. He had imagined 1,000 different outcomes. Aries running, Aries crying, Aries looking at him like he was a stranger, a man who had no right to be here. But he hadn't expected this. Acceptance, trust, an invitation. Zayn nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He reached out, his hands slightly shaking, and carefully picked up a blue block. For the next hour, they built a tower together. Zayn didn't notice the way Meera wiped at her tears in the corner. He didn't hear the world outside. Because for the first time in his life, nothing else mattered. Just this. Just his son. When Aries finally yawned, his small body swaying with exhaustion, Meera moved toward him. "Time for bed, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing his curls back gently. Aries frowned. "But I want to keep playing." Zayn chuckled softly, his voice still thick with emotion. "You need sleep, little one." Aries hesitated, then turned to Zayn. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Zayn felt something crack wide open inside him. Because for so long, he had never been a man who stayed. Never been the kind of man who promised things he couldn't keep. But looking into Aries' hopeful, sleepy eyes, there was only one answer. "Yes," Zayn said, his voice firm. "I will." Aries nodded sleepily, as if that was all he needed to hear. He curled into Meera's arms, his small fingers reaching out at the last second, grasping Zayn's sleeve. As if afraid to let go, Zayn gently covered Aries' hand with his own. A silent promise, a vow that was stronger than any contract he had ever signed. And in that moment, Zayn knew, he hadn't just gained a son today. He had been given a second chance. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. If this moment moved you, if you believe every child deserves to be loved unconditionally, then leave a comment below. Tell us, do you think Zayn deserves a second chance? And if you believe in the power of family, forgiveness, and love, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Because this isn't the end of Zayn and Aries' story. It's only the beginning. Zayn had spent his entire life believing that wealth could fix anything. Power could bend the world to his will. Money could solve any problem. But standing outside Meera's small apartment, hearing the muffled giggles of his son on the other side of the door, he realized something painfully obvious. All the money in the world couldn't buy back lost time. And he had lost so much of it. Meera opened the door, her expression guarded. She had let him into Aries' life. But not into hers. Not yet. She crossed her arms. "What are you doing here, Zayn?" His voice faltered. Because how did he say it? How did he explain that for the first time in his life? He didn't know what to do. That he was terrified of failing? That the thought of Aries looking at him one day, with disappointment instead of trust, was more than he could bear. He cleared his throat. I want to spend the day with Aries. Meera studied him, as if looking for any hint of insincerity. Then she exhaled. All right. Zayn blinked. He hadn't expected her to agree so quickly. But, she added sharply, this isn't a game, Zayn. If you're doing this out of guilt or obligation, then don't. His stomach twisted. He deserved that. But still, he shook his head. I want to do this right. Meera, I know I can't fix the past, but I can be here now. Her expression softened just slightly. Then prove it. Zayn had made million-dollar deals in a matter of minutes. He had flown across the world to negotiate partnerships with the most ruthless men in business. And yet, standing in a tiny, cluttered living room, watching his son hop onto the couch with an excited grin, he had never felt so unprepared. Aries beamed up at him, swinging his little legs. What are we gonna do today? Zayn hesitated. What did fathers do? He had never had one. Not really. His own father had been cold, distant, a man who only acknowledged his son's existence when it benefited him. Zayn refused to be that man. And yet, he had no idea how to be anything else. What do you want to do? He asked. Aries scrunched his nose. Mommy and I go to the park a lot. Zayn nodded, relief washing over him. That, at least, he could do. Then let's go. Aries practically leapt off the couch, grabbing Zayn's hand without hesitation. The warmth of his son's tiny fingers curled around his own sent a sharp, unexpected ache through his chest. How many times had Aries reached for someone, and Zayn hadn't been there? Not again. At the park, Aries ran full speed toward the swings. Zayn followed behind, feeling awkward, out of place among the other parents. Mothers chatting, fathers pushing their kids on the swings, laughing, playing, completely at ease. Zayn had stood in rooms full of the world's most powerful men and never once felt like an outsider. But here, he felt like a fraud. Push me, Aries called, already climbing onto the swing. Zayn hesitated, his hands flexing. Could he do this? Did he even deserve to? Aries tilted his head. You don't know how? The question wasn't mocking or judgmental. Just curious. Zayn exhaled, stepping forward. I've never done it before. Aries grinned. It's easy. Just push me. Not too hard. His trust was effortless, immediate. Zayn placed his hands on Aries's small back and pushed. The swing moved forward, then back. Aries laughed, the sound bright, unburdened. And just like that, Zayn felt something inside him shift. Something heavy lift. Something long buried resurface. This was what he had missed. Not boardrooms. Not wealth. The sound of his son's laughter in the wind. Aries wanted to try the monkey bars next. Zayn stood beneath him, ready to catch him if he fell. Go slow, Zayn cautioned, his hands hovering just in case. I can do it, Aries declared, swinging forward, and then his fingers slipped. Zayn lunged forward, catching Aries before he could hit the ground. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Aries peeked up, his lip trembling slightly. I almost did it. Zayn lowered him gently to the ground. He recognized that look, that frustration, that stubbornness. That had been him once, a boy who had tried, failed, and had no one there to pick him back up. You did great, Zayn murmured, brushing dirt from Aries's knee. Aries sniffled. But I fell. Yeah, Zayn said, but you'll try again. Aries hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. And Zayn, for the first time, felt like a real father. Later that night, as they sat on Meera's small couch, Aries yawned, curling up beside Zayn. Zayn froze. He was used to people keeping their distance. He had built entire walls around himself, ensuring no one got close. But this tiny child trusted him completely. Aries's small fingers gripped the fabric of Zayn's sleeve, his head resting against Zayn's side. And Zayn couldn't move, because if he did, he feared he would break down completely. Are you gonna come back? Aries murmured sleepily. Zayn swallowed hard. This wasn't just a question. It was a test. Aries had already been left once. Zayn refused to fail him again. Yes, he whispered, pressing a kiss to Aries's curls. I promise. Zayn stood outside Meera's apartment, staring at the peeling paint on the doorframe, his heart pounding harder than it had in any boardroom negotiation. Inside, his son slept peacefully, curled up under a blanket that smelled of home. A home Zayn had never been part of. Not fully. Not the way he should have been. Tonight was different. Tonight, everything would change. He had made promises before. But tonight, he was going to prove he meant them. For months, Zayn had worked to earn back the trust he had shattered. He had shown up. He had stayed. He had tried. And yet, he still woke up every morning wondering if he was enough. Meera had been patient, but not forgiving. She had let him see Aries. But she hadn't let him back into her heart. And could he blame her? He had been reckless. Cowardly. He had walked away when things got hard, convincing himself that distance was better than failure. But he had been wrong. And now, standing here, ready to fight for his son's future, he wondered if it was too late. Meera opened the door, her expression unreadable. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. Zayn sat on the couch, rubbing his palms together. His mouth felt dry. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Finally, he spoke. I want to take Aries with me. Meera's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? Zayn exhaled. Not permanently. Just for a few days. I want him to see my world. Meera. To know that I'm not just a visitor in his life. That I'm his father. Meera folded her arms, her gaze sharp. And what happens when you get overwhelmed? Zayn? When work calls. When life gets complicated, do you just walk away again? He flinched. Because she wasn't wrong. But he met her gaze. Unwavering. I won't. Not this time. Meera sighed, shaking her head. Aries loves you, Zayn. But love isn't enough. He needs consistency. He needs to know that when he wakes up, you'll still be there. Zayn's throat tightened. He knew what it was like to wake up to an empty house. To a father who never stayed. And he would rather die than let Aries feel that same pain. I'll prove it, he whispered. Meera studied him for a long moment. Then nodded. All right, but if you mess this up, Zayn, you don't get another chance. Aries's tiny suitcase sat on the floor of Zayn's penthouse. Half unpacked, the boy bounced on the bed, full of endless energy, while Zayn watched, amused, but terrified. He was responsible for this small, bright soul. For 3 whole days. No assistants. No nannies. No help. Just him and his son. Aries grinned. What are we gonna do? Baba? Zayn swallowed hard. Baba. The word hit him differently this time. Not just a title. A promise. Well, he said, clearing his throat. What do you want to do? Aries's face lit up. Can we make pancakes? Mama says I always make a mess. Zayn chuckled. I don't doubt that. In the kitchen, flour ended up everywhere. Eggshells landed on the counter instead of the bowl. And Zayn, one of the world's most powerful men, had never felt more out of his element. But when Aries giggled, tossing a handful of flour into the air, Zayn laughed too. A deep, unrestrained, genuine laugh that he hadn't heard from himself in years. Maybe ever. The next morning, Zayn woke up to find Aries sprawled across his bed, taking up more space than his tiny body should allow. For a moment, he just watched him sleep. This was what he had missed. The quiet moments. The little things. Aries stirred, blinking up at him. Baba? Zayn smiled. Yeah? Aries yawned, curling closer. I like staying here. Something tightened in Zayn's chest. He had spent years chasing success, running from attachments, convincing himself that love was a weakness. But this was the only thing that had ever really mattered. That afternoon, the sky darkened, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Aries stood by the window, biting his lip. Are you scared of storms? Zayn asked, kneeling beside him. Aries hesitated, then nodded. A little, but Mama always sings to me when it gets bad. Zayn's stomach twisted, because for 6 years, he hadn't been there. For the storms, for the nightmares, for any of it. He reached for Aries's tiny hand, squeezing gently. How about we make up our own song? Aries's face lit up. Really? Zayn nodded. Really? And so, as rain pounded against the windows, father and son sat together, humming a silly tune, laughing, making memories that should have existed long ago. On the last night, Aries curled up beside Zayn, fidgeting. Baba? He murmured. Zayn brushed a hand through his son's hair. Yeah? Aries hesitated. Then, are you gonna leave again? The question hit like a blade to the chest. Zayn inhaled sharply. This was it, the moment of truth. No, he said, voice steady. I won't. Aries searched his face, as if trying to figure out if he was lying. Zayn understood that look all too well. It was the same one he had worn as a boy, waiting for a father who never came back. But Zayn wasn't that man. He would never be that man. I promise. Aries, he whispered, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. I'll always be here. Aries smiled sleepily. Okay. And just like that, Zayn knew he had won something more valuable than money, more precious than power. He had won his son's trust. Love is not just words. It's showing up. It's staying when things get hard. It's choosing someone every single day. Zayn made his choice. What do you think? Did he deserve a second chance? Comment below. Should Aries forgive him completely? Or should he still be cautious? And if you believe in redemption, love, and second chances, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this story isn't over. It's just beginning. Zayn had never felt fear like this before. Not in the high-stakes business deals. Not in the boardrooms where billions were on the line. Not even in the moments when he had stood on the edge of his own reckless decisions, wondering if he had made a mistake too great to undo. But this was different. Because this time, it wasn't about money or power. It was about his son. It was about proving that he was the kind of man who stayed. The kind of father Aries could trust. And tonight, that trust was being tested like never before. It had started with a fever. A slight warmth on Aries's forehead when Zayn tucked him into bed. Meera had sent him with a bottle of medicine and instructions, but Zayn had never been great at following directions. He had checked his son's temperature and told himself it was nothing. That he would be fine by morning. But when Zayn woke up to the sound of Aries crying, his small body trembling under the blankets, his heart nearly stopped. His son's skin was burning. His tiny hands clutched at Zayn's shirt. Desperate. Afraid. Baba. Aries whimpered. It hurts. Panic slammed into Zayn like a freight train. For a moment, he was frozen, watching his son. Helpless. This was why Meera never fully trusted him. This was why she hesitated whenever he talked about taking Aries for longer stretches of time. Because she knew that Zayn had never been the one to handle the hard moments. She had been the one who soothed the nightmares. She had been the one who sat up all night when Aries was sick, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, whispering lullabies until he finally fell asleep. And now, it was Zayn's turn. For the first time, there was no assistant, no doctor on speed dial, no one to fix this for him. It was just him and his son. Zayn scooped Aries into his arms, cradling him close. It's okay, little one, he murmured, his voice betraying the fear clawing at his chest. I've got you. Aries whimpered, his head lolling against Zayn's shoulder. He had never felt so small, so fragile. Zayn grabbed the phone with one hand and dialed Meera. She answered on the first ring. Zayn? She sounded groggy, half asleep, but when she heard Aries's soft cries in the background, her voice sharpened with worry. He's burning up, Zayn said, his voice tight. I don't know what to do. Meera, tell me what to do. There was a beat of silence. Then, put him in a lukewarm bath, she said quickly. Not cold, just enough to bring his temperature down slowly. Zayn was already moving. His heart pounded as he carried Aries to the bathroom, his hands shaking as he turned on the faucet. Meera's voice came through the phone, steady, guiding him. For once, he was the one being told what to do, and he listened. He placed Aries in the water, holding his little body upright as he whimpered. Zayn whispered to him the whole time, telling him it was okay, telling him Baba was here, telling him he wouldn't let anything happen to him. And as the minutes passed, as the fever slowly began to drop, Zayn felt something shift inside him. When the worst of it had passed, Zayn carried Aries back to bed, sitting beside him with a cool cloth pressed to his forehead. The little boy's eyes fluttered open. You didn't leave, Aries murmured, his voice hoarse. Zayn inhaled sharply, his fingers clenched around the cloth. No, he didn't leave, and he never would again. I'll always be here, Aries, he whispered, pressing a kiss to his son's damp forehead. Always. Aries let out a soft sigh, his tiny fingers curling around Zayn's sleeve. He fell asleep like that, his breathing slow and even. Zayn sat there for hours, unable to move. He thought about the times he had left before, the moments he had missed, the ways he had failed. And he made a vow to himself. No more. Never again. By the time the sun rose, Aries's fever had completely broken. He woke up slowly, stretching his small limbs, his bright eyes blinking up at Zayn. Baba? Zayn was still there, still sitting by his bed, still watching over him. Aries smiled, small, sleepy. You stayed. Zayn let out a shaky breath. Nodding. Of course I did. Aries reached up, placing a tiny hand on Zayn's cheek. Zayn froze. And then, I love you, Baba. It was the first time Aries had ever said it. The first time those words had ever left his lips. And Zayn broke. Right there, in the quiet of the morning, with his son's little hand on his face. With the weight of everything he had missed pressing down on him, he broke. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over before he could stop them. He cupped Aries's tiny face, pressing his forehead against his son's. I love you too, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. So much. Aries giggled, wrapping his arms around Zayn's neck. And in that moment, everything was worth it. Every mistake, every sleepless night, every battle he had fought to be here. Because this was what mattered. Zayn had thought he had faced the hardest battles already. Winning back Meera's trust. Proving to Aries that he would never leave again. Learning, day by day, how to be the kind of father his son deserved. But life had a way of testing you when you least expected it. And tonight, Zayn was being tested in the worst way possible. It started as a normal evening. Zayn had spent the day with Aries. Just the two of them. They had gone to the park, played soccer, and stopped by Aries's favorite ice cream shop on the way home. Zayn had tucked him into bed, read him a story, something about a brave knight who never ran from a fight, and kissed his forehead. I love you, Baba, Aries had murmured sleepily. Zayn's heart had swelled, just like it always did. He had whispered it back, watching as his son drifted into sleep, his tiny hand still clutching Zayn's sleeve. He had no idea that, within hours, his world would be turned upside down. It was just after midnight when the phone rang. Zayn groggily reached for it, barely registering the number on the screen. Mr. Zayn? The voice on the other end was tense. Hurried. This is from the hospital. Your son. Zayn didn't hear the rest. His heart stopped. His breath vanished. His entire body went cold. All he could hear was the sound of blood rushing in his ears. Aries. His son was in the hospital. Zayn bolted out of bed, his mind racing. He didn't remember grabbing his car keys. Didn't remember getting in the car. Didn't remember the drive. All he knew was that one moment he was at home, safe. Everything fine, and the next. He was running through the sterile halls of the emergency room, demanding answers. When Zayn finally reached the pediatric ward, he saw Meera standing outside the hospital room, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale, his heart clenched at the sight. What happened? He rasped. Meera. Where is he? Where's Aries? She looked up at him, her eyes rimmed with red. The fever came back, she whispered. I thought it was nothing. But then he started struggling to breathe. Her voice cracked. Zayn had never seen her like this. Meera, strong, composed Meera, was breaking right in front of him. And that terrified him more than anything. Before he could say another word, a doctor approached. Mr. Zayn? Zayn turned, his hands clenching into fists. How's my son? His voice was rough, unsteady. The doctor gave him a measured look. We're doing everything we can. His oxygen levels dropped dangerously low due to an infection. We've stabilized him for now. But he's still not responding the way we'd like. Not responding. Zayn's stomach twisted painfully. His son was lying in that hospital bed, fighting for breath, and there was nothing he could do. The doctor continued. He's been asking for you. Zayn's breath caught in his throat. He didn't wait for permission. Didn't ask if he could go inside. He just went. The room was too bright, too cold, too sterile. But none of that mattered. Because in the center of it all, his small body swallowed by the too large hospital bed, was Aries. Wires and tubes surrounded him. His tiny chest rose and fell, weak but steady. And when Zayn reached him, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, Aries's eyes fluttered open. Baba. Zayn's throat closed. He reached for his son's hand, holding it tightly between both of his. I'm here, little one, he whispered. Aries's fingers barely curled around his. Did you stay? Aries's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Zayn's vision blurred. He pressed his forehead against his son's hand, swallowing the ache in his throat. I stayed, he promised. I'm not going anywhere. Aries let out a small breath, his eyelids heavy. And then, he slept. Zayn stayed awake, watching, praying, holding his son's hand, refusing to let go. The next morning, the fever finally broke. The doctors came in with cautious smiles. He's strong, they said. He's going to be okay. Zayn exhaled shakily, running a trembling hand through his hair. Meera let out a soft sob of relief beside him. Aries was going to be okay. And as Zayn sat beside his son's hospital bed, his fingers still curled around the little hand that had held onto him through the night, he realized something. He had passed the test. Not just tonight, not just through the fear, but through everything. He had shown up, he had stayed, and he would never stop staying. Zayn stood at the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. The skyline was breathtaking, a masterpiece of glowing towers and flickering stars. But none of it mattered. Not tonight. Tonight, his heart was in one place, the small apartment where Meera and Aries were waiting for him. Waiting for his answer. For months, Zayn had fought for his place in their lives. He had rebuilt trust, one moment at a time. He had proven his love, not just with words, but with actions. And now, he was faced with the most important choice of his life. Would he let them go? Or would he give up everything to build a life with them? The answer should have been easy. But old fears had a way of clawing their way back in, whispering doubts into his mind. Zayn closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He had already lost them once. He would not lose them again. His family's name carried weight, power, expectation. For years, he had been raised to believe that love was secondary to duty. That emotions made a man weak. That a child born outside of his legacy, without a predetermined path, was a mistake. His father's voice still echoed in his head. You cannot erase the past, Zayn, but you can correct your future. Marry the right woman, have the right heir, do what's expected of you. But Zayn no longer cared about doing what was expected. He had spent too long running from the only thing that had ever truly mattered. And for what? A life of empty successes? A legacy built on sacrifice and regret? He had spent the last year learning what real strength was. It wasn't power. It wasn't wealth. It was standing in front of a little boy who had once looked at him with doubt in his eyes and making a promise to never leave again. It was watching Meera, beautiful, strong Meera, open her heart to him again. Despite the pain he had caused her. It was love. And he was done running from it. Zayn didn't drive to his family's estate that night. He didn't sit down with his father to discuss marriage alliances or business mergers. He didn't go back to the man he used to be. Instead, he got into his car and drove straight to Meera's apartment. He didn't hesitate, didn't think. He simply knocked on the door, heart pounding, breath shallow, and waited. The door opened slowly, and there she was, Meera, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes filled with questions. Behind her, Aries was on the floor, building a tower with his toy blocks. Zayn took a deep breath. I made my decision, he said softly. Meera searched his face, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. Zayn exhaled shakily and did something he had never done before. He dropped to his knees. Meera gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Aries stopped playing, his little eyes widening in surprise. I've spent my whole life chasing the wrong things, Zayn said, his voice thick with emotion. Power, status, approval, but none of it has ever made me happy. Meera's breath hitched. I thought I had to prove something to the world. That I had to be the perfect son, the perfect businessman, the perfect heir. He shook his head. But the only thing I ever needed to be was the man you and Aries deserved. Zayn reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Meera gasped again, this time covering her mouth with trembling fingers. I don't want a legacy built on expectations. Zayn continued. I want a legacy built on love, on laughter, on family. Aries climbed to his feet, inching closer to his mother, his little face curious. Zayn turned to him, his voice breaking. Aries, he whispered, can I be your father? For real? Forever? Aries blinked. Then, without hesitation, he ran forward and threw his tiny arms around Zayn's neck. Zayn's heart shattered in the best way possible. Meera let out a small sob. And then, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Zayn, yes. The wedding was small. Not a grand, over-the-top affair with hundreds of guests. Not a business arrangement sealed with empty smiles. It was just them. Zayn, Meera, Aries, and the people who truly mattered. Meera walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, more radiant than Zayn had ever seen her. Aries ran ahead of her, his little suit slightly crooked, a huge grin on his face as he carried the reins. And when Zayn took Meera's hands in his, he knew, this was it. His real beginning, his real purpose, his real home. As they exchanged vows, he made a silent promise. Never again would he let fear keep him from the people he loved. Never again would he choose duty over happiness. Never again would he be the man who walked away. And as he kissed his wife, as Aries tugged at his sleeve and laughed, as their family and friends cheered around them, he knew he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Love is not about being perfect. It's about choosing each other. Every single day. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. It's about staying, even when it's scary. Zayn learned that lesson the hard way. But he learned it. And now? He gets to spend the rest of his life proving it. So tell me, did Zayn deserve this happy ending? Do you believe in second chances? Or do you think he still had more to prove? Comment below. Let's hear your thoughts. And if you believe in the power of love, redemption, and the courage to fight for what truly matters. Like this story. Comment to support Zayn and Meera. Subscribe for more emotional, life-changing stories. Because every story deserves a second chance, just like Zayn did.